Chair, and thank you, Ms. Missel, for your willingness to serve. I was going to ask the question Senator Bozeman mentioned about why do you want the job. I think that's always an important one, particularly a very important job like this, but as you've heard, a job that's probably going to not be easy by any stretch. Let me ask just a couple basic questions and maybe a hypothetical or two. Is the IG, who do you think your most important client is?
I think the most important client are the veterans and the American public.
Good. Do you think our veterans have lost faith in the VA?
Based on what I've read, a number of veterans seem to have lost faith in the VA.
So how do we get it back?
I think it's just making the VA a better agency, more effective. And part of the way you do that is by having an Inspector General's office that's identifying issues, making recommendations, and having those recommendations be implemented.
How about the issue of accountability for the VA?
I think that's an important issue as well.
You think that, like, you've been reading about it, veterans read about it, the American public reads about it, we read about it. Big screw-ups in the VA, and then nobody ever seems to be accountable. Do you think that undermines the faith our veterans have in the VA?
If people are asking the questions, then it undermines it, yes.
So to me, that would be one of the most important elements of the IG job is bringing back the issue of accountability. Would you agree with that?
I agree.
Let me ask, you mentioned a lot of the qualities. I think you have a lot of really important elements in your resume. You talked about skills, judgment, investigations, audits. I think another thing the IG has to have, though, is you mentioned independence. I also think aggressiveness needs to be part of those qualities. Can you provide some examples of that in your background? Kind of tough examples where you need to be both tenacious and independent, maybe even independent of people who you ostensibly work for?
Sure. In some of the large, complex investigations I've done, I've needed to be independent, needed to be aggressive, needed to be fair, which is key, and accurate. And all the investigations that I've done, they've all stood up to the test of time.
So give me an example, more specific than just general.
I was appointed by the Department of Justice to be the examiner in the bankruptcy proceeding of New Century Financial, which was the largest subprime lender. So I put out a report about how the company was originating subprime mortgages and about all the problems at New Century.
Let me ask more specific. Let's say, I think your relationship with the leadership of the VA, the IG, that's going to be really important. It's going to be kind of critical. And, I think a lot of us recognize Secretary McDonald, Undersecretary Shulkin, others are doing a good job, working hard. Strong personalities there. But let's say you went into the Secretary's office and said, Ms. Secretary, I'm going to need access here. I want to meet 3 times a month, just to let you know what we're doing, what's important. And he said, I'm a busy guy. I don't want to meet with you 3 times a month. What would you say to the Secretary?
If I felt strongly, I would say, Mr. Secretary, I believe it's important to meet 3 times a month.
What would you say to the Secretary if you went to him on a big issue that you investigated and said, Mr. Secretary, you need to take action on this. You need to fire 5 people in the VA. And he says, I'm not going to do that. What would you do?
It's his decision on
Is it, though? I mean, you're independent. Whose decision is it?
It's his decision. I can make recommendations. I can put the facts out as I find them, but it's ultimately his decision on what actions to ultimately take.
We've been talking about transparency. We've been talking about at what point you would come to Congress. At what point would you come to Congress on something like that? Let's say the Secretary says, you tell him you need to fire 5 people. He says no. What point do you say, I'm going to use my independent judgment, keep accountability to the veterans? You don't work for the Secretary. I couldn't agree more with your answer. You work for the veterans of the United States of America. At what point do you, in your judgment, have to say, I work for the veterans of the United States of America, the Secretary's not doing what I think is ethical, I'm going to come to the chairman of this committee? When do you do that?
think depending on the situation, a very serious matter may very well, but also you have the power of the pen to issue reports, to identify issues you think are important.
What if an investigation you had found some kind of fraud in the Secretary's office or fraud in the White House? What would you do then?
I think that would be what I would consider a very serious situation and likely would be coming to this committee.
Could you be more definitive on that? Fraud in the Secretary's office or fraud in the White House relating to our veterans?
I think I would be coming to this committee. It depends on the type of fraud, who was involved in the Secretary's office, the impact it had, et cetera. But those sound like very serious situation.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I have a few more questions, but I'll yield until there's another round, if that's okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a few more questions, Mr. Missel. One is kind of a more local question with broader national implications. So Alaska, we have more vets per capita than any state in the country. So your position is very important. A lot of people are going to be focused on it because we've had, like a lot of states, a lot of problems. We've actually had a real problem with the implementation of the Choice Act. So I won't bore you with the details, but a lot of the ideas in the Choice Act actually came from some of the things that were actually working in Alaska, remote delivery of services, et cetera. And then yet, when it was implemented, the new Choice Act, it was completely botched in my state, unequivocally. We've held hearings. The chairman and the ranking member have been very helpful on that. In the state, I took Dr. Shulkin across Alaska in August with a bunch of his team to hear, listen, see what the problems are. He saw it firsthand. He completely recognizes that there's an enormous problem with the implementation of the Choice Act in Alaska, to such a degree that he committed to me to work in an Alaska-specific plan that the Veterans Administration is presently working. Now, this is almost a year, right, that we've been having these problems. I was coming back on a flight from Alaska on Sunday night, just my flight. Within this place I was sitting on the airplane, 3 different veterans on this plane from Alaska to Minneapolis said to me, "Geez, Senator, it's good to see you sitting on the plane with us. This Choice Act is a disaster." 3, within 3 rows of me. And then the other guy, "Yeah, it is. Holy cow. I thought you were going to fix this. I thought you guys were going to fix this." Just on one plane, in one little area. So my question, the broader question is, so I've been working with the Secretary, Dr. Shulkin, on this, but at what point do we, and this is more your sense, my sense, I don't know what the right answer here is, but at what point should someone like myself, who's very focused on these issues because it matters so much to my constituents and to all veterans throughout the country, should we keep working with the leadership, or at a certain point turn to you and say, "Gosh darn it, I need an investigation on this. What the heck is wrong with the implementation of the Choice Act in my state?" When do we quit? When do we give up with them and come to you? What's your sense of that? Because I don't want to do that. I mean, but I'm not going to wait forever. And I'm not going to sit on more airplanes where half the plane are Alaska veterans and they're not getting the care that they need. So how would you advise us on at what point do we turn to you and say an independent assessment on how we fix this?
Right. Well, I obviously don't know the specific details of it all, but if they're working through the implementation and they feel there's still other things that can be done, it seems like that should be implemented through the agency. To the extent you reach a point where you just say something is wrong here, I'm just not getting the answers, or the answers I'm getting don't seem right, then at that point it may be appropriate to have the IG look into.
So when do we call? When do you think, in general, good guidance for us? Because you're going to get a lot of requests for good guidance for us to call on you and your services.
You know, in that situation, if you think you've reached a dead end, or the information you're getting is not correct, or you just don't think it's what you're looking for, then that could be something the IG should be looking into.
Let me just, one final question. It's a question that everybody's been asking here today on transparency. And I'm sure you saw the October 2nd USA Today report naming you to be tapped by the president as the new VA watchdog, and it said that the agency in the IG's office has been criticized following a USA Today report in March of this year that showed that the VA Inspector General had failed to publicly release the findings of more than 140 investigations of veterans' health care, including cases of harm and death. So I think that's why you're seeing such a concern among everybody here on transparency. What are going to be the principles, if you're confirmed, that will guide you in terms of transparency? Why do you think 140 investigations of veterans' health care, which I'm assuming were requested by the Congress, were not publicly released?
I don't know the specific details of that, but my preference would be err on the side of disclosure as opposed to non-disclosure, because I agree that transparency is a really critical issue, and it's one to increase the trust and confidence that people will have in the Office of Inspector General.
And just finally, on my previous round or theme of questions, if I do get to the point where this Choice Act implementation in my state continues to be completely screwed up, would you commit to me to undertake an investigation if it was the appropriate time? And I'm not saying it is right now, but it will be at some point, to do that?
I will.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Bo.